He ruled the mightiest empire on earth, yet feared his own shadow. He called himself a god, but acted like a beast. Behind the marble halls, witnesses spoke of stolen brides, vanished senators, and feasts that ended in blood. This is the story of the emperor who mistook cruelty for power. Watch closely, and decide for yourself if Caligula was born a monster or made into one. Subscribe now so you don't miss the darkest chapters of Rome's history. Power reveals the truth no crown can hide. Caligula began as Rome's shining hope, but behind closed doors, his mercy turned to menace. What began as celebration became submission. Rome had gained an emperor but awakened a tyrant. Rome never forgot the name Caligula. To the public, he was a savior, young, charming, and full of promise. He arrived at a time when the empire was weary from the cruelty of Emperor Tiberius. The Senate cheered his rise, the streets filled with joy, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Rome had found its new Augustus. He spoke softly, forgave debts, freed prisoners, and staged games to unite the people. It was a performance of grace. But it was only an act. Inside the marble halls of power, another face began to form, colder, sharper, detached from reason. Caligula studied those around him, learning how quickly admiration turned into fear. He enjoyed the silence that followed his words, the trembling in men's voices when they swore loyalty. He began to believe that fear was the truest form of respect. Soon, the palace became his theater. Every meal, every meeting, every whisper was a test of obedience. Senators laughed when he laughed, even when he mocked them. Courtiers praised his beauty, though his eyes revealed a storm. A misplaced word could cost a life. A hesitant gesture could mark a traitor. Those who dined with him never knew if they would leave the table alive. He learned that cruelty could bend stronger men than kindness ever could. Executions became spectacles. Commands turned into games. He spoke of mercy, but practiced humiliation. The line between ruler and executioner vanished. What he did in private soon bled into public life, shaping a reign where logic had no place. For the first time, Rome's heart beat under one man's will, not through faith, but through fear. The empire stood tall, but beneath its marble skin, it trembled. Caligula had mastered the art of performance, and the stage was now his throne. He was no longer the prince of promise. He was the shadow Rome had created, and soon that shadow would consume the light. No tyrant is born cruel. He is forged by loss, betrayal, and the slow death of innocence. Before Caligula demanded worship, before he stained Rome with madness, he was a child surrounded by power and haunted by ghosts. Caligula's story began in 12 AD, in the coastal town of Antium. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, carried the weight of Rome's destiny. He was born to Germanicus, the empire's most adored general, and Agrippina the elder, a woman of proud lineage and fiery spirit. Their family stood at the center of Rome's power, a blessing that quickly became a curse. From his earliest days, Caligula followed his father to the frontier. Soldiers adored the boy in miniature armor and tiny boots, calling him Caligula, meaning little boots. The name would follow him forever. But while the army saw charm, fate was already sharpening its claws. In Syria, Germanicus fell ill under mysterious circumstances. Rumors spread that he was poisoned on orders from Emperor Tiberius, jealous of his popularity. His death shattered the family. Agrippina accused Tiberius of murder. Rome whispered her words. The emperor responded with exile and death. Caligula watched as his mother and brothers were destroyed one by one. He learned what defiance cost in a world ruled by suspicion. Alone, stripped of safety, the boy who once marched beside legions was taken to the island of Capri. There, under Tiberius' watch, he lived among monsters disguised as men. Capri was a palace of pleasure and punishment, a place where loyalty was tested through fear. Caligula saw nobles executed for amusement, servants vanish for mistakes. and silence become the only shield dot in that golden prison. He learned 3 lessons that would never leave him. Trust no one. Hide every thought, and strike before being struck. Each day carved something cold into him. He became the perfect survivor, obedient on the surface, burning beneath. When Tiberius finally died, the Senate rejoiced, and Caligula was lifted to the throne. But the boy shaped by terror had not forgotten what Rome did to his family. Behind his smile, revenge and vanity began to stir. The child called Little Boots was gone. What returned was an emperor molded by fear and eager to make the world feel it. Before Caligula ruled with madness, he learned to live among monsters. The island of Capri was his classroom. Every scream, every betrayal, every feast of blood taught him one lesson: kindness is fatal, and silence is survival. When Caligula arrived on Capri, he was still young. But youth offered no protection in the court of Emperor Tiberius. The island was paradise on the surface, with gardens and marble pools overlooking the sea. Yet behind its beauty hid rot. It was a palace of cruelty. Tiberius ruled not as a statesman but as a predator, feeding on fear, suspicion, and obedience. Caligula became his silent shadow, smiling through terror, waiting for his chance to outlive the man who had destroyed his family. He saw men executed for whispers. He saw senators crawl for forgiveness. Servants vanished without explanation. Death became a routine, served between wine and laughter. Caligula learned to applaud when Tiberius smiled, to weep when he frowned, and to never reveal what he truly felt. To survive Capri, one had to become part of the mask. Over time, the island changed him. His heart hardened, his conscience dulled. He began to see cruelty not as horror but as order. Every death was proof that power belonged to those who dared to use it. Each injustice was a reminder that in Rome, mercy had no place. When Tiberius asked if he feared him, Caligula answered softly, "No, Caesar." In truth, he feared becoming him, and yet the seeds of that transformation were already taking root. When Tiberius's trusted prefect, Sejanus, fell from grace and was executed, Caligula witnessed the fragility of power. One day a man commanded armies, the next his body was food for crows. That image stayed with him. It taught him that authority is only real when everyone else believes it. Fear sustains it. Loyalty does not. Years passed in that gilded prison. By the time Tiberius grew frail, Caligula had learned to wear calm like armor. When the emperor finally died, some said a pillow ended his breath. Others said fate itself intervened. Caligula walked away from Capri as heir to the empire. Polished, patient, and hollowed-out Rome cheered its new ruler, unaware that Capri had built him into something else, a survivor who no longer believed in mercy. The boy who survived Capri now held the crown. Rome cheered his name, blind to the shadow behind his smile. Caligula had learned to play the innocent, but within him waited every lesson the island had taught. Trust no one. Fear nothing, and never forgive. When Emperor Tiberius died in 37 AD, the empire erupted in joy. His rule had been marked by paranoia and cruelty, and Caligula, young and charming, seemed to promise renewal. Crowds filled the streets chanting his name. Statues of his father, Germanicus, were raised once again. For the first time in years, Rome felt hope. The Senate greeted him with reverence. The people hailed him as a savior. To them, he was the son of the noble general they once loved. The symbol of Rome's better past. At first, Caligula played his part perfectly. He ordered the release of prisoners, restored property seized under Tiberius, and paid tribute to the victims of past injustice. He hosted games, festivals, and parades. Gold flowed from the treasury to the streets. He spoke of unity, justice, and compassion. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire had found its golden age again. Senators called him the beloved of the gods. Women blessed his name. Even the soldiers who once fought beside his father swore eternal loyalty. But behind the applause, another truth grew. Caligula's joy was not born of mercy, it was victory. The same men who had once destroyed his family now bowed before him. The same Senate that condemned his mother now begged for his favor. He smiled at their praise, but inside he saw only hypocrisy. Each cheer reminded him of how Rome had broken him, and now, how completely it belonged to him. Then came the turning point. Only months after his coronation, Caligula fell gravely ill. For days he drifted near death. When he recovered, witnesses swore something in his eyes had changed. The calm was gone. His laughter became sharper, his temper sudden. Gratitude turned to suspicion. He began speaking of destiny, of divine signs, of power beyond human reach. Rome still celebrated him, unaware that the illness had not just scarred his body, it had split his mind. The survivor of Capri no longer needed to act. The boy who once endured fear now sought to command it. And from that moment, mercy left the empire. When Caligula rose from illness, he no longer believed he ruled by blood or law. He believed he ruled by divinity. The empire had given him a crown. Now he wanted an altar. Rome had birthed a man, and that man had decided to become a god. After his recovery, Caligula stepped into the light not as a grateful survivor, but as something transformed. The Senate saw it first. His gaze lingered longer. His tone carried command instead of reason. He no longer spoke of Rome's glory. He spoke of his own. Those around him whispered that death had touched him and failed. Caligula heard those whispers and embraced them. To him, it was proof that he was chosen. He began to appear in public wearing golden robes, jeweled crowns, and symbols of the gods. In temples, he demanded sacrifices be made in his name. He replaced statues of Jupiter and Mars with ones bearing his face. In his mind, Rome's gods were not protectors but rivals. He wanted their worship. He wanted their fear. When citizens prayed, they were told to look not to the heavens, but to the palace. His portraits were placed in shrines, his name spoken in blessings. Priests who refused were executed or exiled. Caligula's empire was no longer bound by tradition. It was bound by his image. His arrogance reached beyond Rome. In Judea, he ordered a statue of himself placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a sacred space that forbade idols of any kind. News of the command spread like fire. Revolt seemed certain. Only the pleading of Herod Agrippa, his childhood friend, stopped catastrophe. Caligula withdrew the order, but not from humility. He did it because he could. Even restraint became proof of power. He began staging appearances like divine ceremonies. Surrounded by incense and chanting, he would stand before crowds as light struck his golden cloak. Those watching saw not reverence but warning. He was no longer acting as emperor. He was demanding obedience as a god. To question him was blasphemy. To refuse was treason. Every subject became a worshiper. Every word a prayer. Rome had bowed to emperors before, but none had asked for its soul, and so began the empire's descent, ruled not by man or law, but by one who believed himself eternal. Only a man lost to madness would declare war on the sea. Yet Caligula did. Armed with swords and shields, Rome's legions marched against the waves. To his soldiers, it was a spectacle. To Caligula, it was proof that even the gods must kneel. By now, his belief in divinity had consumed him. Caligula no longer saw boundaries between earth, man, and myth. In his mind, the empire was limitless because his will was divine. When generals warned him of impossible orders, he called them cowards. When senators questioned his decrees, he accused them of blasphemy. And when storms halted his fleet, he blamed Neptune, the god of the sea. Determined to prove his supremacy, Caligula prepared a campaign unlike any in Rome's history. The enemy was not a nation, but an ocean. At the northern coast of Gaul, He assembled thousands of soldiers and commanded them to face the waters as if preparing for battle. Drums thundered. Standards waved. He raised his arm and gave the order to attack. Swords slashed into waves. Spears hurled into foam. The soldiers obeyed, terrified of disobedience. To defy Caligula was death. The sea roared back indifferent. When the battle ended, he declared victory. His troops, soaked and silent, watched as he commanded them to collect seashells, spoils of war, trophies from Neptune's defeat. These were carried back to Rome in triumph. The emperor paraded before crowds, holding the shells aloft as proof that no force, not even the sea, could deny him. To some, it was satire. To others, insanity. But for Caligula, it was divine theater. He was rewriting the laws of nature. Every absurd act reaffirmed his belief that reality bent to his will. Those who laughed did so quietly. Those who questioned disappeared. What seemed comedy was terror in disguise. The emperor's orders could no longer be predicted. Logic had no place in his court. His generals obeyed nonsense. His senate applauded madness. And his people learned to cheer even when they feared. Through that false war, Caligula proved one truth. An emperor who commands the sea will never hear the cries of men. He had silenced the gods, or so he thought. But in doing so, he drowned the last trace of reason within himself. Behind the golden robes and divine titles, Caligula hid a truth he could never escape. The man who demanded worship feared his own reflection. Beneath the god's crown lived a fragile soul, terrified of mockery and desperate to be seen as more than mortal. Power had made Caligula untouchable, but it could not make him whole. Those who served him began to notice his strange obsessions. He spent hours before mirrors, practicing the art of intimidation. His face twisted into forced fury. His eyes widened to instill dread. He believed that fear began with a glance, and if he could perfect that look, no one would dare challenge him. But the more he tried to appear divine, the more human his insecurities became. Chronic illness had left him pale and thin. His hairline receded early, and whispers compared him to a goat. In Rome, where appearance reflected power, these jokes cut deep. Caligula outlawed the word goat in his presence, and forbade anyone from standing above him, afraid they might glimpse his baldness. Guards cleared balconies before he entered, and painters who failed to flatter his likeness were punished. Each act of vanity revealed a deeper wound. The boy who had once cowered before Tiberius still lingered inside. The emperor's grandeur was armor for that child's humiliation. Every insult became treason, every shadow a threat. He surrounded himself with flatterers who fed his delusion, telling him he shone brighter than Jupiter. He listened, because he needed to believe it. At night, servants recalled his pacing, restless, sleepless, haunted. Some said he spoke to the moon. Others swore he muttered to unseen gods. Whether prayer or paranoia, none dared to interrupt. Power had isolated him. Even surrounded by luxury, he trusted no one. He feared betrayal as much as irrelevance. In time, his insecurities became law. Citizens were ordered to honor his divine beauty. Those who failed were beaten or banished. It was no longer enough for Rome to obey. It had to adore, but worship built on fear cannot heal a fractured mind. The emperor who saw himself as a god was still ruled by the weakness he tried to bury. And the more he fought it, the more the mask began to crack. When cruelty becomes ritual, power turns into spectacle. Caligula no longer ruled from the throne. He ruled from the arena, where every drop of blood reminded Rome that mercy had died, and madness now wore the laurel crown. For centuries, the Colosseum had been the empire's theater of glory. Gladiators fought for honor, prisoners for pardon, and spectators for thrill. But under Caligula, the arena became something darker. It was no longer a stage for courage. It was a mirror of the emperor's mind, unpredictable, violent, and obsessed with control. He did not watch as a ruler. He watched as a god passing judgment. When a fighter fell, Caligula's thumb decided life or death. At first, the crowds cheered. They had seen emperors before, but none so involved, none so eager. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a grand festival, Caligula pointed to a senator who had bored him with talk of politics. With a single gesture, guards dragged the man into the sand. Moments later, he faced trained killers while the emperor laughed. From that day, no one felt safe in his presence. Guests who attended his games came dressed for both feast and funeral. To displease him was to die. Even the victorious gladiators were uneasy. Caligula demanded unpredictable outcomes, forcing fighters to kill when they should have spared, or spare when they should have struck. His will replaced justice. His pleasure became law. Once, in front of thousands, he descended into the arena himself. Opposite him stood a gladiator armed only with a wooden blade. It was meant to be symbolic, a show of imperial valor. But when the man knelt in surrender, Caligula drew a real dagger and drove it into his throat. The crowd froze, torn between horror and applause. Caligula raised his arms as if returning from war, bathed not in glory but in blood. That was the moment Rome understood. The games were no longer entertainment. They were sacrifice. The emperor's madness demanded witnesses, and the people were trapped between loyalty and terror. Each scream fed his ego. Each silence confirmed his power. The arena that once celebrated heroes now echoed with fear. Rome's greatest stage had become a warning. When cruelty rules, all are performers in its play. At Caligula's table, laughter was a weapon, and silence could kill. His banquets were not gatherings of nobles, but ceremonies of submission. Every guest knew the truth. One smile from the emperor could mean a toast, or a death sentence. Rome had seen lavish feasts before, but nothing matched the decadence of Caligula's banquets. Gold-lined couches, endless wine, and dishes made from rare beasts filled the hall. Musicians played softly while servants hurried to please their god-emperor. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. To those seated inside, it was purgatory. Caligula's meals began with charm. He joked, laughed, and praised his guests. Yet behind his grin, he studied every reaction. A glance too slow, a whisper too soft, any detail could ignite his wrath. He enjoyed watching fear spread like fire. To him, it was proof of absolute power. At the height of the feast, his cruelty took form. If a senator spoke too proudly, Caligula mocked him before the crowd. If a guest seemed distracted, he might order their execution before dessert. But his darkest amusement came from turning intimacy into humiliation. He often pointed to a man's wife, praised her beauty, and ordered her to follow him. Minutes later, he returned, boasting loudly about what he had done, laughing as the room fell into silence. None dared to look away. None dared to breathe too loudly. Women were trophies. Men were pawns. Every act of degradation reaffirmed his dominance. He wanted Rome to know that no bond, not even marriage, stood above his will. Wine flowed endlessly, but joy was forbidden. The more the guests laughed, the more they trembled. They never knew when Caligula's humor would twist into rage. Even his friends learned that favor was fragile. A single misstep could end a life before the night was over. When dawn arrived, those who survived stumbled out in silence, pale, shaken, thankful to breathe. The streets outside were quiet, yet within the palace, music still played. These banquets were not about pleasure. They were lessons. Caligula's cruelty was deliberate, performed to remind Rome that it dined only at his mercy. And every guest left knowing that in his world, joy and terror shared the same cup. When marble was not enough, Caligula built on water. His desire for control reached beyond land and law. Upon the calm surface of Lake Nemi, He created drifting temples of indulgence, floating kingdoms. Where sin was the only commandment, Caligula's hunger for luxury had no limit. Palaces no longer satisfied him, nor did feasts or colosseums. He wanted a realm no emperor had claimed, a paradise that defied nature itself. He ordered engineers to construct vast ships on Lake Nemi, south of Rome. These were no vessels of war or trade. They were floating palaces, colossal and blinding with ornament, designed only for pleasure. Each ship shimmered with marble floors and golden columns. Gardens bloomed across decks. Statues of gods and goddesses stood between baths of scented water. Rooms were lit by oil lamps crafted from silver. Musicians played beside pools, and servants moved barefoot so their steps would not disturb the emperor's dreams. On these ships, Caligula ruled without witnesses. Here, he could become what he believed himself to be, a living god unbound by judgment. Surrounded by music, dancers, and wine, he indulged every impulse. Senators, nobles, and slaves all served one purpose: to entertain the emperor's will. Nights blurred into endless rituals of excess. No command was too strange, no desire too great. To Caligula, these ships symbolized his mastery over both man and nature. He had forced the sea to obey him once. Now he forced it to carry his palace. Each wave that rocked the deck reminded him that even the elements could serve his pleasure. Yet beneath the glitter, whispers grew. The treasury emptied to sustain his fantasies. Laborers died building what the emperor would soon forget. When storms struck, entire decks were torn apart. But Caligula never cared. To him, destruction proved power. If something could be broken, it meant it belonged to him. Years later, the ships sank, vanishing into the depths. Centuries passed before their remains were discovered. Marble fragments, bronze fittings, and carvings of divine faces now eroded by time. They told a story not of glory, but of obsession. Lake Nemi became his mirror. Smooth above, dark below. Just like the emperor who believed beauty could hide his decay. Caligula didn't just crave worship, he craved submission. The Senate once shaped Rome's destiny. Under him, it became a stage for mockery. Every meeting was a reminder that power no longer listened, it only laughed. The Roman Senate had survived wars, rebellions, and emperors. It was the voice of tradition, the guardian of law. But when Caligula took the throne, that voice was silenced. He no longer saw the Senate as a council, but as a collection of actors, performing obedience before their ruler. Every session became theater, and every senator his unwilling audience. He would summon them without warning, forcing them to wait for hours before entering. When they arrived, he sometimes greeted them in silence, simply watching as they squirmed under his gaze. Other times, he demanded applause after meaningless speeches or absurd decrees. Senators clapped until their hands bled, afraid to be the first to stop. Caligula enjoyed seeing Rome's elite crawl. Men who once commanded armies now begged for his approval. He accused them of crimes without evidence, seized their property, and forced them to thank him for mercy. In one session, he burst into laughter mid-debate, claiming he could execute any of them at will, and that the only reason he didn't was boredom. His most infamous insult came through a single act of ridicule. He adored his horse, Incitatus, more than any senator. The animal lived in a marble stable, wore jewels around its neck, and ate from golden bowls. But Caligula wanted more. He announced that Incitatus would soon become consul, the highest political office in Rome. Some thought it was a joke. Others knew it was a message. The Senate was so useless, he implied, that even a beast could lead it. None dared protest. Fear had replaced dignity. The lawmakers of Rome were now props in Caligula's show. Every humiliation reinforced his belief that respect could be demanded, not earned. For the people, it was proof that Rome's order was collapsing. For Caligula, it was entertainment. The empire's greatest institution had become his toy, bent and broken beneath his laughter. And with each act of mockery, he pushed Rome closer to the edge, until the hands that once applauded him began to plan his end. Power had devoured Caligula's sanity, but desire stripped away what little restraint remained. The emperor who mocked gods and enslaved senators began crossing lines even Rome feared. His lust for control turned inward, corrupting blood, family, and identity. Among all his scandals, none unsettled Rome more than his bond with his sister Drusilla. She was his closest companion, present at every feast and ceremony, seated beside him in the imperial box during games. Whispers spread that their closeness had become something darker. He called her his equal. He forbade others from addressing her without his leave. When she entered a room, he rose, an act once reserved only for the gods. When Drusilla fell ill and died, Caligula's grief became spectacle. He shut down the empire's offices, declared days of mourning, and ordered the Senate to grant her divine honors. Temples raised her image beside his. He named her Panthea, goddess of all things. Some said he had loved her not as a sister, but as a wife. Whether truth or rumor, the message was clear. In Caligula's eyes, blood, law, and morality were tools to be bent by will. His disregard for boundaries didn't end there. He appeared in public dressed as goddesses, Venus, Diana, Isis, parading through temples in silk and jewels. To him, identity was just another mask. By wearing the forms of gods and women, he claimed to embody every divine power at once. But to Rome, it was blasphemy. Masculine virtue defined their order, and Caligula's displays tore through that tradition. He sought pleasure wherever he found it, taking wives, mistresses, and even the spouses of his allies. No home was safe from his desire. He entered banquets not as a guest, but as a hunter. Resistance meant ruin. Acceptance meant shame. The emperor no longer recognized human limits. Every boundary, political, moral, or sacred, became a wall to be shattered. Each act of defiance deepened his isolation. Even those who worshipped him began to fear what he might do next. The empire that once adored him now whispered behind closed doors. Senators, guards, even family saw that Rome could not survive a man who believed himself untouchable. The god of Rome had broken his last taboo, and soon his worshippers would turn on him. Every tyrant believes fear will keep him safe. Caligula learned too late that fear breeds silence, and silence hides daggers. The man who called himself a god would die like any mortal, betrayed by those who once bowed at his feet. By 41 AD, the empire had reached its breaking point. Caligula's reign had drained the treasury, insulted the Senate, and terrorized his guards. The people whispered of omens, storms over temples, statues cracking, fires breaking out near the palace. To many, these were warnings from the gods. But Caligula saw only confirmation of his divinity. He laughed at prophecy, believing fate itself was beneath him. Yet while he mocked the heavens, a plan formed in the shadows. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, had become his prison. He humiliated their officers in public, struck them in drunken rage, and forced them to carry out his whims. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a soldier Caligula taunted endlessly for his soft voice. Day after day, the emperor made him repeat obscene phrases before the court. Chaerea's humiliation festered into resolve. The opportunity came after a festival. Caligula had spent the night celebrating with his entourage, laughing, drinking, and mocking the Senate once more. As dawn approached, he moved through a corridor beneath the palace, surrounded by guards. The torchlight flickered across marble. Then came the first blow. A dagger pierced his chest. Stunned, Caligula turned, but the second strike cut off his breath. More followed. The emperor who had demanded worship fell to the ground, choking on blood. The god was mortal after all. Panic followed. His wife Caesonia and their young daughter were also killed to erase his line. Outside, rumors raced through the city. Some rejoiced. Others trembled. The Senate briefly tried to restore the Republic, but power does not vanish, it transfers. Within hours, the guards crowned Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as emperor. Rome moved on, but the memory of its fallen god lingered like smoke. Caligula's death did not end his story. It became a warning. Historians would argue for centuries whether he was mad, cursed, or simply corrupted by absolute power. But one truth survived. When fear replaces reason, even empires built on stone can crumble. Caligula believed himself immortal. History proved otherwise. Power can build nations, but in the wrong hands, it consumes them. Caligula's reign lasted only 4 years, yet its scars shaped Rome for generations. His cruelty turned loyalty into silence, faith into fear, and empire into theater. He believed himself divine, but his legacy was human, fragile, violent, and unforgettable. His story reminds us that tyranny rarely begins with chaos. It begins with applause. A crowd cheers, a senate obeys, and a ruler learns that no one dares say no. From that moment, truth fades. Those who survive stop speaking. And soon, madness wears a crown. History recorded his crimes, but not his conscience. We can only guess what he saw when the mirror stared back. Perhaps a god. Perhaps a boy still trapped on Capri, desperate to never feel powerless again. Rome buried his body, but not his shadow. The name Caligula endures because every age finds new rulers who mistake obedience for devotion and fear for respect. His life stands as a warning that the greatest danger to any empire lies not in its enemies, but in the man who believes he is above them. If this story made you look deeper into the faces of power, remember to subscribe and turn on the bell icon. There are more truths buried in history, waiting to be uncovered. And some, like Caligula's, still echo through the halls of every throne.